scorching sun blazed over the palace grounds, suffocating the air with its heat. The guard stood firm, but one began to sway, his body trembling under the crushing weight of duty. Then, without warning, he collapsed, hitting the ground with a brutal thud. Princess Charlotte didn't hesitate. She rushed to his side, her hands steady as she worked to keep him conscious. Tune in to see how her fearless act led to a shocking truth that would change the palace forever. The princess who refused to look away. The sun blazed high above the palace grounds, casting long shadows over the neatly trimmed hedges and pristine stone paths. The air was thick with heat, and every breath felt heavy, as if the warmth itself pressed against her skin. The guards stood like statues, their postures rigid, their expressions unreadable. The thick, dark fabric of their uniforms absorbed the relentless sun, and though that they were trained to endure all conditions, something was wrong. Then a single scream pierced the air, sharp, terrified. Something was very wrong inside the palace. Princess Charlotte noticed before anyone else. A flicker of unsteadiness, a barely perceptible tremor in one of the guard's shoulders. Her sharp eyes locked onto him, studying his posture. He was swaying ever so slightly, his knees locked too tightly, his grip on his ceremonial sword clenched a little too hard. Her heart quickened, instinct whispering that something wasn't right. Then, in an instant, it happened. The guard's body wavered, his footing slipped, and he crumpled. The fall wasn't slow, it wasn't graceful. It was heavy, sudden, and final. His tall frame hit the gravel with a dull thud, the weight of exhaustion pulling him down completely. The stillness of the palace grounds shattered as gasps rippled through the onlookers. Charlotte barely had time to process what she had seen before her feet carried her forward. The world blurred, the crowd a distant murmur as she sprinted toward him. Her dress, delicate and pale blue, billowed slightly behind her, but she didn't stop. Kneeling beside him, she reached out, fingers brushing against his sleeve. His skin was clammy, his pulse faint but steady. She wasn't a doctor, but she had learned enough to understand the basics of dehydration and heat exhaustion. She had overheard palace staff discussing the dangers of standing for hours under the sun, the importance of hydration, the toll duty could take, and now it was all happening before her eyes. Digging into the small bag she carried, she pulled out a handkerchief and a tiny bottle of water. The cool cloth dabbed against his forehead, offering the smallest relief from the relentless heat. She worked quickly, carefully, her hands steady despite the tension curling in her chest. His breathing was shallow, his eyes fluttering but unfocused. She tilted his head slightly, adjusting his posture in a way she had read about, something meant to help with airflow. He needed help beyond what she could offer, but she refused to leave his side. Footsteps thundered behind her as staff rushed forward. Their expressions wavered between urgency and shock. This was not supposed to happen. The guards were supposed to be unshakable, unwavering, a living wall of discipline and strength. But now one of them lay on the ground, vulnerable in a way that made Charlotte's stomach twist. By the time the medics arrived, she had done everything she could. As they took over, she stepped back, watching closely. Even as they lifted him onto a stretcher, she didn't look away. Something about this moment felt significant, deeper than a simple collapse. There was more to it, something unseen but deeply felt. In the medical wing of the palace, she lingered, watching as the doctor examined him. Words like overexertion, fatigue, and severe dehydration filled the space. They nodded solemnly, discussing recovery plans, hydration levels, and periods of rest. But Charlotte listened past the medical jargon. This wasn't just about the heat. It wasn't just about exhaustion. It was something else, something heavier. Her suspicions only grew as she pieced together fragments of whispered conversations among the palace staff. She overheard discussions about Thomas. That was his name, she learned. He was diligent, devoted to his duty beyond measure. He had a family, a son who was ill, medical bills that never stopped piling up, extra shifts taken to ensure his loved ones had everything they needed. He had carried the weight of responsibility alone for far too long, and today that weight had finally forced him down. Charlotte's hands clenched into fists. The idea of someone pushing themselves this hard, with no safety net, with no one to lighten the burden, made something burn inside her. She couldn't ignore it. She wouldn't. The solution wasn't simple, but that never stopped her before. She brought the issue to her parents, explained everything she had seen, everything she had learned. She expected them to hesitate, to tell her this wasn't her concern. Instead, they listened. They saw the determination in her eyes and understood that this wasn't just a fleeting interest. This was something she was ready to fight for. A plan took shape, not just to help Thomas, but to ensure that no one else in the palace service found themselves in the same position. A fund was created, not a handout, but a support system, something to provide relief in times of crisis. Wellness programs were introduced, resources made available to help with stress, finances, and health. It wasn't a grand announcement or a flashy event. It was quiet, efficient, and, most importantly, effective. Weeks later, when she visited Thomas again, he looked different. There was color in his face, strength returning to his posture. He was still recovering, but the exhaustion that had weighed him down seemed lighter. When he met her gaze, there was something new in his expression. Gratitude. Hope. He didn't need to say anything. She understood. The moment changed everything for her. She saw the palace differently now. The guards, the staff, the people who made everything run smoothly. They weren't just part of the background. They were people with lives, struggles, and dreams. And leadership, she realized, wasn't about standing above others. It was about seeing them, truly seeing them, and making sure no one was left behind. Years later, when people told the story of the princess who saved a royal guard, they spoke of the dramatic moment in the sun-drenched courtyard. But for Charlotte, that wasn't the important part. The real story was in what came after, in the changes made, in the lives touched. And it all began with a young girl who refused to look away when someone needed help. The sun was unforgiving, but something else felt off. Charlotte just didn't know what yet.
A princess's first challenge. Her heart raced. Without a second thought, she ran to him. The guard's body was heavy against the gravel, his eyes fluttering open, but not really seeing anything. Quickly pulling a small handkerchief and a tiny bottle of water from her bag, she dabbed his face gently. Then he fell silent, leaving her with more questions than answers. Her small hands worked quickly and carefully, doing everything she could to make him comfortable. She tilted his head slightly, remembering something she'd learned in a first aid class. It was a simple trick to help him breathe better. Her mind was racing, but her actions were calm and steady. She called out for help, and soon some staff from a nearby path came running. But even with help on the way, she didn't leave his side. She kept wiping his forehead and holding his trembling hand. By the time others arrived, she had already done everything she could. "He needs help," she told them, stepping back so they could take over. But something about the whole situation didn't feel right to her. In the infirmary, she watched quietly from the corner as the doctor examined the guard. Though his color improved slightly, he still looked weak. The doctor's face showed concern as he muttered about dehydration and overexertion. But there was something else. Stress, perhaps? The doctor's words echoed in her mind as she pieced together the fragments of what she had seen and heard. The guard stirred slightly, and his lips moved. Though his voice was barely a whisper, she caught a few words. "Can't let them down." Her heart ached. This wasn't just about physical health. It was clear he was carrying a heavy burden, one that was too much for him to bear alone. She couldn't walk away now. This moment was no longer just an accident she happened to witness. It was a call to action. Her young mind raced with thoughts of how she could help. She had seen enough to know that sometimes people need more than medicine. They need someone to care, to listen, and to be there when things feel too hard to handle. As she stood there, watching the doctor and the staff care for the guard, she made a silent promise. Whatever this man was going through, she would make sure it didn't go unnoticed. This was about more than just helping him recover. It was about understanding the struggles that had brought him to this point. And with her quiet determination, she resolved to do whatever it took to make a difference. The staff member hesitated but eventually revealed that the guard, named Thomas, had been working tirelessly to support his family. He had a young son and mounting bills that weighed heavily on him. The stress of his personal life combined with the physical demands of his job had taken a toll. Hearing this, her resolve grew stronger. She began thinking of ways to help Thomas and others like him. She spoke to her mother and father about what had happened. Though they were initially cautious about her involvement, they saw the determination in her eyes and agreed to let her help in a way that was appropriate for her age and position. She started by organizing a small support fund for the guards and their families. Reaching out to trusted advisors and staff members, she ensured that the initiative was handled with care and discretion. The fund would help with unexpected expenses, providing a safety net for those who needed it most. She also suggested implementing stress management and wellness programs for the guards, understanding that physical and mental health were equally important. Weeks later, she visited Thomas in the infirmary. He was recovering and his gratitude was evident. Though he was still quiet and reserved, he thanked her for her kindness and quick thinking. She didn't need grand gestures of thanks. Seeing him on the mend was enough. The experience had a profound impact on her. It taught her about the hidden struggles people face, even those who seem strong and unshakable. She learned that compassion and action go hand in hand, and that even small efforts can create ripples of change. Her initiative grew quietly but steadily, making a tangible difference in the lives of those around her. Years later, this moment would stand out as a turning point in her life. It was a lesson in leadership, empathy, and the importance of looking beyond appearances to understand the challenges others endure. And it all began with a simple walk on the royal grounds, a moment of crisis, and a young girl's determination to make things better. The crowd gasped, but her feet moved before her mind could catch up. She darted forward, her heart thumping as though trying to match the urgency of the situation. Crouching beside the guard, her fingers brushed against his sleeve. He was still conscious, but just barely. Sweat glistened on his forehead, and his breathing was shallow. A medic rushed over, and she stepped back, watching as they worked swiftly to assess his condition. Her young eyes turned back to him, now stabilized and resting on a stretcher. He was vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before, and it struck her deeply. This was the man who'd stood at attention day after day, a symbol of strength and tradition. And yet, beneath that polished exterior was someone struggling, human like everyone else. The guard's story didn't leave her mind. Over the next hours, she pieced together his life through quiet conversations with the palace staff. Footmen and housekeepers shared whispers of his devotion to his family, his youngest son's illness, and the mounting medical bills. It was a story of resilience, of a man who bore his struggles silently, never allowing them to interfere with his duty. She couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen and knew she had to do something. When kindness met determination, her heart ached with every detail she learned. She imagined him standing for hours on end, his thoughts miles away with his son. The picture was both inspiring and heartbreaking. She couldn't let it end there. She couldn't just move on, not when she knew the weight of his burden. That night, as the palace quieted, she sat by her window. The moonlight spilled across her desk as she scribbled ideas on a notepad. She wasn't sure what she could do, but she knew she had to do something. Her young mind, unburdened by the cynicism of adults, brimmed with possibilities. If she couldn't fix everything, she could at least try to make a difference. The next morning, she set her plan in motion. She spoke with advisors, her voice steady and insistent despite her age. She wanted to ensure the guard's family had what they needed while he recovered. The palace could provide support, she argued, not just as an act of charity, but as a gesture of gratitude for his service. Her efforts didn't stop there. She reached out to organizations that could offer medical assistance and financial counseling. She worked quietly but tirelessly, determined to create a ripple effect that would ease the guard's burdens in the long term. Every step she took felt like a step closer to showing him that his sacrifices had not gone unnoticed. As weeks passed, the guard's health improved. He returned to his post, but there was a lightness in his step that hadn't been there before. His son's treatments were now manageable, and the support from the palace had given him the breathing room he so desperately needed. She watched from a distance, her heart swelling with quiet pride. She knew she couldn't fix everything, but she had done something that mattered, and in doing so, she had learned a lesson that would stay with her forever. Compassion, she realized, wasn't just about feeling for someone, it was about action, about stepping forward even when it felt easier to stay still. The young princess's actions became a small but powerful story within the palace walls. It was a reminder that even in the grand halls of royalty, it was the small, heartfelt gestures that truly melted hearts. And in her youthful determination, she had proven that sometimes it was the youngest voices that spoke the loudest truths. Her journey didn't stop there. Her determination to make a difference grew stronger with each passing day. She began to see the lives of those who served the palace through a new lens. Each person carried a story, a struggle, and a strength that often went unnoticed. Her efforts expanded beyond just the guard. She began visiting the kitchens, the stables, and the staff quarters, learning about the people who worked tirelessly behind the scenes. One day, while speaking with a housekeeper who had worked at the palace for decades, she learned about the challenges of balancing work and family. The housekeeper's children had grown up while she was busy ensuring the palace ran smoothly. The stories of missed birthdays and milestones tugged at her heart. She realized that the sacrifices made by those around her were not just physical, but deeply personal. She decided to create a fund to support the families of palace staff. She proposed initiatives that would provide educational opportunities for their children and healthcare benefits for their loved ones. Her ideas were met with some skepticism at first, but her persistence won over even the most hesitant advisors. She worked closely with the palace's financial team to ensure the initiatives were sustainable and impactful. Her compassion didn't go unnoticed. Stories of her efforts began to spread beyond the palace walls. Letters poured in from people inspired by her actions. Some shared their own struggles, while others offered to contribute to her initiatives. Her work became a beacon of hope for many, a reminder that kindness could ripple outward and create meaningful change. As she grew older, her sense of responsibility deepened. She continued to champion causes that aligned with her values. Her experiences as a young princess shaped her into a compassionate leader who understood the importance of empathy and action. The guard story and the lessons it taught her remained a cornerstone of her journey. Years later, when the guard's son grew up, he wrote a letter to her. In it, he thanked her for the kindness she had shown his family. He shared how her support had allowed him to pursue his dreams and build a better future. She read the letter with tears in her eyes, grateful for the reminder of the impact one act of compassion could have. The story of the princess and the guard became a cherished tale, passed down through generations. It was a story of hope, resilience, and the power of small actions to create lasting change. And it all began with a young princess who refused to look away from someone in need, who chose to step forward and make a difference, one heartfelt gesture at a time. It was a sunny afternoon, and the palace grounds buzzed with their usual quiet rhythm. The princess, always curious and observant, was enjoying her stroll near the grand gardens. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something unusual. One of the royal guards had suddenly collapsed right in the middle of his post. The sight stopped her in her tracks. Charlotte's heart raced as she watched the palace staff rush to the guard's aid. He was quickly taken away for care, but the image of his fall lingered in her mind. Who was this man? What had caused him to falter? Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and her room glowed with warm lamplight, Charlotte found herself surrounded by paper, pens, and small treasures she had carefully picked out. Her thoughts returned to the guard and the burdens he must carry. She couldn't just forget what had happened. Her small actions had made a difference, but she felt there was more to do. A blanket, a letter, a life changed. The young princess started planning. She had overheard the staff talking about the guard's family, how his youngest child was unwell. That little detail tugged at her heart even more. She decided to send something comforting, a soft blanket with the child's name stitched onto it, a few cheerful books, and art supplies to brighten the little one's days. She imagined how these small things might bring some joy. For the guard himself, Charlotte chose a leather-bound journal, a place where he could write down his thoughts and feelings. She thought maybe it would help lighten the load he carried silently. She also included a discreet gift card to a local shop, something to make life a little easier for his family. The palace staff helped her arrange it, ensuring her gesture remained private and thoughtful. The centerpiece, though, was a letter she wrote herself. Charlotte's handwriting was careful and deliberate as she poured her thoughts onto the page. She wanted the guard to know his hard work didn't go unnoticed, that his resilience inspired others. She sealed the letter with the royal crest, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. But Charlotte didn't stop there. She thought of how much the guard's sacrifice meant, not just to the royal family but to his own loved ones. His story needed to be recognized. Summoning her courage, she approached her grandparents, the king and queen consort, with a proposal. Her voice, steady but full of emotion, explained what she had learned about the guard's life and struggles. The king listened carefully, his expression serious. When Charlotte suggested a formal commendation for the guard service, the queen consort nodded thoughtfully. They agreed her idea was a good one. A few days later, the palace announced that the guard would receive a royal commendation for his dedication and sacrifices. The ceremony was to be small but significant. On the day of the ceremony, the guard stood before his peers and the royal family, his uniform crisp and his eyes brimming with emotion. As the commendation was presented, Princess Charlotte stood with her parents, her heart full. She could see how much this moment meant to him, how it validated all he had endured. Afterward, the guard approached Charlotte. His gratitude was deep and genuine. Though he didn't say much, his words stayed with her. In the days that followed, Charlotte's gifts found their way into the guard's home. His young son, wrapped in the embroidered blanket, laughed for the first time in weeks. The art supplies sparked a flurry of colorful creations that soon adorned the walls of their home. The guard's wife even wrote a letter to the palace, thanking Charlotte for her kindness. She spoke of how the gifts had brought hope and light to their family during a tough time. Reading the letter, Charlotte felt warmth spread through her. She thought of that moment in the garden when she had seen the guard fall and how it had led to all this. One small act of noticing, followed by compassion, had made a difference. Charlotte whispered to herself, "Kindness can change everything." And as she went about her days, she carried that thought close, knowing it to be true. But this story didn't end there. Charlotte's interest in the guard's family led her to learn more about their lives. She discovered that the guard's wife worked long hours to make ends meet while also caring for their children. Their youngest son, battling a chronic illness, had spent weeks in and out of the hospital. It was a struggle that required immense strength and resilience from the entire family. The more Charlotte learned, the more she felt driven to help. She spoke with the palace staff, asking if there were additional ways to support the family discreetly. Together, they arranged for regular deliveries of fresh groceries and household essentials. These were presented as anonymous gifts, ensuring the family felt supported without feeling singled out. Charlotte also started a small project within the palace, a fund to assist palace staff and their families during difficult times. With the help of her parents, she worked on the logistics, ensuring the initiative was sustainable and confidential. She wanted to make sure no one else felt they had to bear their burdens alone. Meanwhile, the guard's son grew stronger. The colorful drawings created with the art supplies brightened their home, and the blanket became a cherished comfort item. The family found themselves smiling more, even as they navigated their challenges. Each gesture of kindness from Charlotte seemed to ease their worries just a little more. The guard, now back at his post, carried himself with a renewed sense of purpose. He often thought about the day he had fainted, how it had been a moment of vulnerability that he would have rather avoided. Yet, it had led to something remarkable. His family's struggles had been acknowledged and their pain eased by unexpected kindness. It reminded him that even in his darkest moments, there was light to be found. Charlotte, too, had grown through the experience. She had always been empathetic, but this event had taught her the power of action. It wasn't enough to feel for someone. You had to show it, to let your compassion translate into something tangible. She found herself looking for other opportunities to help, whether it was a kind word to a staff member or organizing donations for a local charity. Months passed, and the small project Charlotte had started within the palace began to take on a life of its own. Other members of the royal family contributed, and soon it became a well-structured initiative. Stories of staff members receiving help in their times of need began to circulate. A sense of camaraderie grew within the palace, fostering a stronger community. Charlotte often reflected on how one moment could ripple outward, touching lives in ways she couldn't have predicted. The guard's story became a part of her own journey, a reminder of the responsibility she carried as a member of the royal family. It wasn't about titles or grandeur. It was about using her position to make a difference where she could. The young princess continued to grow into her role, her heart firmly rooted in empathy and action. She knew she couldn't solve every problem, but she could make a start. And sometimes, a start was all it took to change everything. Who truly holds more power? Those with titles or those who inspire change through action? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe.